I knew something was wrong the moment I saw the trash can where my seat should have been. The white folding chairs were arranged in perfect rows across the garden, each decorated with soft ivory ribbons that fluttered gently in the late afternoon breeze. At the front, beneath an arch of pale roses and eucalyptus, 2 seats were reserved for the parents of the groom. One had a small, elegant card that read, "Mr. Robert Whitmore," my late husband's name placed there in quiet honor. The other spot, where my chair should have been, held a small metal trash can with a paper sign taped to it that said "Mom's Seat." For a moment, I simply stood there, holding my purse in both hands, unsure if I was seeing it correctly. Guests were beginning to arrive, chatting softly as they found their places. A few people glanced at the setup, then quickly looked away. One young cousin covered her mouth to hide a laugh. I could hear the faint music of a string quartet warming up somewhere behind the rose bushes. The whole scene was beautiful, carefully planned, expensive, and yet that small silver trash can seem to glow like a spotlight in the middle of it all. I walked closer, my heels pressing into the soft grass, and gently touched the paper sign as if it might disappear if I looked long enough. It didn't. "Oh, Margaret, you found it already." Ashley's voice floated toward me, bright and amused. My daughter-in-law appeared beside me in her satin bridesmaid robe, holding a glass of sparkling water. She tilted her head and smiled, like someone sharing a harmless secret. "Relax," she said lightly, lowering her voice as if explaining something obvious to a child. "It's just a joke. Don't be so dramatic." I turned slightly and saw my son Daniel standing a few feet behind her. He was already dressed in his tuxedo, the same black jacket I had helped him choose 2 months earlier when we visited a tailor in downtown Boston. He looked handsome, older than I remembered. His eyes met mine for only a second before drifting toward the garden lights strung above the ceremony space. He didn't laugh, but he didn't say anything either. Around us, the wedding planner and her assistants hurried past carrying trays of champagne flutes. The smell of fresh-cut roses filled the air. Somewhere behind the garden hedge, guests were beginning to gather near the entrance path, their voices blending into a soft hum of excitement. I realized then that the ceremony would begin in less than 20 minutes. My son's wedding. The day I had imagined for him since he was a boy, building forts in our living room with couch cushions and blankets. The day I had helped pay for when Daniel and Ashley said the venue deposit was higher than expected. The day I had told all my friends about with pride in my voice. And there I stood beside a trash can labeled "Mom's Seat." Ashley was still smiling, waiting for a reaction. I felt several guests watching us now, their curiosity quiet but unmistakable. I could have said something. I could have asked Daniel why he allowed it. I could have told the wedding planner to remove the sign. Instead, I simply smiled. Not a big smile. Just the kind people use when they don't want to make a scene. "Of course," I said softly. "A joke." I adjusted the sleeve of my navy blue dress and stepped away from the chair arrangement. As I walked across the garden path, the gravel crunched gently beneath my heels. Behind me, I heard Ashley laugh under her breath, the sound quick and satisfied. Daniel still didn't speak. The late afternoon sun slipped between the tall oak trees surrounding the venue, casting long golden shadows across the lawn. For everyone else, it was a perfect wedding day. For me, it was the moment I began to understand something I had been missing for years. And the strange thing was, I wasn't angry. Not yet. Mostly, I was paying attention. I did not go back to the chairs. Instead, I walked slowly toward the far edge of the garden where a small stone fountain stood beneath a tall maple tree. The air smelled faintly of roses and freshly cut grass. And somewhere nearby a photographer was giving quiet instructions to a group of bridesmaids. I set my purse down on the edge of the fountain and watched the water ripple in slow circles. For a few minutes no one bothered me, which was exactly what I needed. Weddings have a strange kind of energy. People move quickly, smiling too brightly, speaking a little louder than usual, as if happiness itself has to be performed. I had attended enough weddings in my life to recognize that rhythm. Yet standing there beside the fountain, I felt oddly calm. Not sad, not angry. Just attentive. It was the same feeling I used to have when Daniel was a little boy and I suspected he was hiding something behind his back. I would wait quietly and watch until the truth revealed itself. A few guests passed by and nodded politely. One older couple from Daniel's college days stopped near the walkway and glanced toward the row of chairs. I noticed the woman whisper something to her husband, her eyebrows lifting slightly before they both turned away. I wondered how many people had already seen the trash can and the paper sign taped to it. Probably more than Ashley realized. Probably more than Daniel understood. Weddings are full of eyes. Eventually the music began again, this time a soft violin melody drifting across the lawn. That was the signal that the ceremony would begin soon. I picked up my purse and walked along the curved stone path that led toward the reception tent. White fabric panels fluttered along the edges of the structure, and inside I could see long tables set with polished silverware and crystal glasses that caught the sunlight like small stars. It was beautiful. Everything about the day had been designed carefully. I knew that because I had helped pay for a large part of it. 3 months earlier, Daniel had called me one evening, sounding slightly nervous. The venue, he explained, required a higher deposit than they expected. Ashley wanted the outdoor ceremony, the rose arch, the quartet, the catered dinner with plated service instead of a buffet. I remember standing in my kitchen with the phone pressed against my ear while pasta boiled quietly on the stove. Daniel sounded embarrassed when he asked if I could help. I did not hesitate. I told him that weddings only happen once and that he should not worry about the details. The next morning I transferred $20,000 to the wedding account. At the time it felt like a joyful contribution, the kind a mother is proud to make. Standing there now beneath the white reception tent, I traced my finger lightly along the edge of one of the tables. Each place setting had a small printed card with the guest's name written in. Elegant script. I scanned the rows automatically, curious where they had planned for me to sit during the dinner. Halfway down the second table I found it. Margaret Whitmore. The card rested neatly beside a folded linen napkin. Nothing unusual. Nothing humorous. Just my name, placed like every other guest. I studied the card for a moment before glancing back toward the ceremony chairs across the lawn. The distance between the reception tent and the garden was not very far. From where I stood, I could still see the silver shape of that small trash can reflecting sunlight. Someone nearby laughed loudly as a group of groomsmen entered the tent carrying glasses of champagne. Their voices filled the space with easy excitement. I realized then that Ashley had chosen the ceremony to stage her little joke, not the dinner. The ceremony was where everyone would see it at the same time, where cameras would be pointed, where whispers could travel quickly through a crowd. It was not an accident, and the more I thought about it, the more certain I became of something else. Ashley had been planning moments like this for a long time. The trash can was simply the first one bold enough for me to finally notice. I remained inside the reception tent for a few more minutes, quietly studying the place cards as guests began drifting toward their assigned tables. The soft murmur of conversation grew louder, blending with the distant violin music still playing near the ceremony garden. I picked up my purse and walked slowly back along the stone path, careful with each step in my heels. As I approached the lawn again, the seating arrangement came back into view. The rows of white chairs looked perfect from a distance, almost like a scene from a magazine advertisement. The ivory ribbons moved gently in the breeze, and the rose arch stood glowing in the warm afternoon light. But the small silver trash can was still there between the two reserved signs, quiet and unmistakable. A group of guests had already taken their seats, and I noticed a few of them whispering as they glanced toward it. One man in a gray suit leaned closer to his wife and pointed discreetly with his program. She shook her head slightly and gave a sympathetic look in my direction when she noticed me watching. I returned the look with a polite smile and continued walking until I reached the side aisle near the back row. Standing there, I suddenly remembered another moment from 2 years earlier during Christmas dinner at Daniel and Ashley's apartment. Ashley had prepared a beautiful table that evening with red candles and small evergreen branches placed between the plates. When everyone sat down, I realized there were 8 chairs but only 7 name cards. Ashley laughed lightly and said the extra chair must have been a mistake from the rental company. Daniel suggested I sit on a small stool from the kitchen island instead because it would be easier than rearranging everything. I remember balancing carefully on that stool for the entire dinner while the others sat comfortably around the table. At the time I told myself it was nothing. A simple oversight. A busy holiday moment. But standing in the wedding garden now, looking at the trash can labeled as my seat, that memory returned with a new clarity. It was not the only one either. There was the time Ashley scheduled my grandson's birthday party for 9 in the morning and forgot to mention it until the evening before. There was the Thanksgiving dinner when she placed me at the very end of the table beside the coat rack, because she said the children needed the larger seats. Each moment had seemed small on its own, easy to explain away, easy to forgive. Yet together they formed a quiet pattern that I had not fully acknowledged until now. The violin music faded and the officiant stepped into place beneath the rose arch. Guests settled into their chairs, programs rustling softly like leaves. A wedding planner approached me with a professional smile and asked if I needed help finding my seat. I followed her gaze toward the front row where the trash can waited beside the reserved sign for my late husband. For a second I imagined sitting there, pretending not to notice the joke, while dozens of cameras pointed toward the ceremony. I imagined Ashley watching from across the aisle, satisfied that everyone had seen her little performance. Instead, I placed a gentle hand on the planner's arm and thanked her politely. Then I chose an empty chair in the very last row of the garden. From there the view of the ceremony was smaller, but it was still clear enough to see Daniel standing beneath the arch adjusting his tie. He looked nervous, the way most grooms do before the music begins. For a moment, he glanced across the rows of chairs as if searching for something familiar. Our eyes met briefly across the distance. I lifted my hand and gave him a small wave. He hesitated, then gave a quick nod before turning back toward the aisle. A few seconds later, the music changed to a softer, slower melody. Guests rose to their feet as the bridesmaids began walking down the path. The ceremony had started, and as I stood there among the last row of guests, I realized something important. Ashley believed the trash can had humiliated me. What she did not understand was that it had finally helped me see the entire story clearly. I remained standing in the back row as the ceremony continued, the late afternoon sunlight filtering through the tall oak trees and casting soft patterns across the grass. Ashley walked slowly down the aisle on her father's arm, her white dress moving like a quiet wave behind her. Guests turned in their seats to watch. Cameras lifted gently into the air, and the violin melody floated above everything like a thin thread of silver. From where I stood, Daniel looked both proud and nervous, the way he used to look when he stepped onto the stage during his high school concerts. I remember those nights clearly. I used to sit in the front row of the auditorium with a small camcorder balanced carefully in my hands, afraid to blink in case I missed something important. Daniel had always been the kind of child who searched the audience before every performance, his eyes scanning the crowd until he found mine. Only then would his shoulders relax. That habit stayed with him for years. Even during his college graduation, he looked toward the crowd and smiled when he spotted me standing beside his father. Robert always used to squeeze my hand in those moments and whisper that we had done a good job raising him. Watching the wedding ceremony now from the last row, I thought about Robert more than usual. His empty reserved chair in the front row had been placed with careful respect, a quiet acknowledgement that he should have been there that day. Robert had passed away 3 years earlier after a long winter illness, and Daniel had taken the loss harder than anyone. For months afterward, he called me every Sunday evening just to talk. Sometimes we discussed small things like grocery shopping or weather forecasts. Sometimes we spoke about Robert and the stories Daniel remembered from childhood. During those conversations, he sounded like the same thoughtful boy I had always known. That was before Ashley began organizing every holiday, every gathering, every decision about where Daniel and I would see each other. At first I believed she was simply enthusiastic about family traditions. Some people enjoy hosting more than others. But slowly the invitations became less frequent. Christmas dinners were scheduled on days when I was traveling. Birthday parties were announced only a few hours before they began. When I asked Daniel about it, he always sounded confused and said Ashley must have forgotten to mention something. Standing in the back row of the wedding ceremony, I watched the officiant open a small book and begin speaking about commitment and partnership. The words drifted gently across the garden while a warm breeze moved the ribbons on the chairs. Guests listened quietly, smiling as the couple held hands beneath the arch of roses. It was a beautiful moment, the kind that photographers love to capture. Yet my eyes wandered again toward the front row where the silver trash can remained beside Robert's empty chair. No one had removed it. No one had thought to move the sign or replace it with a proper seat. It simply sat there in plain view while the ceremony continued as if everything were perfectly normal. For a brief moment, I wondered whether Daniel had noticed it during the vows. Perhaps he believed it had already been taken away. Perhaps he assumed I was sitting somewhere among the guests like everyone else. Or perhaps he understood exactly what Ashley had done and chose not to interrupt the ceremony, because it would be awkward. Weddings move quickly, and people often avoid small conflicts in order to protect the celebration. I understood that better than most. But as the officiant invited the couple to exchange rings, a quiet realization settled over me with surprising clarity. Ashley had not placed the trash can there for a private joke between family members. She had placed it where every camera lens and every curious guest would eventually see it. The purpose had never been humor. The purpose had been to send a message. And as I stood there in the last row of chairs watching my son promise his future to someone who enjoyed small humiliations disguised as jokes, I finally began to consider what message I might choose to send back. I stood quietly through the rest of the ceremony, listening to the words about partnership, loyalty, and building a life together. The guests applauded softly when Daniel and Ashley exchanged rings, and a warm ripple of celebration moved through the garden when the officiant announced them as husband and wife. Cameras clicked rapidly as they turned toward the aisle and began walking back down together, smiling brightly for their friends and family. From the last row, I joined the applause like everyone else, my hands moving slowly and calmly. As the guests began drifting toward the reception tent, I stayed where I was for a moment longer, watching the rows of chairs empty one by one. The silver trash can was still sitting beside the reserved sign for my late husband. A breeze lifted the paper label slightly, making the words flutter for a second before settling again. I walked toward it at an unhurried pace. A few guests passed me along the aisle, speaking excitedly about the ceremony and the upcoming dinner. No one stopped me. When I reached the front row, I bent down and gently peeled the paper sign from the side of the trash can. The tape came off easily. I folded the paper once and slipped it into my purse without saying anything. The trash can itself I simply moved 2 feet to the side, so it was no longer beside Robert's chair. It was a small adjustment, but it restored the quiet dignity of that empty seat. For a moment I stood beside it and imagined what Robert would have said if he had seen the scene earlier. My husband had always been a patient man, but he understood respect in a way that did not require loud words. After a few seconds, I turned and followed the other guests toward the reception tent where the evening celebration was beginning. Inside, waiters were already circulating with trays of sparkling water and champagne, and soft music drifted from hidden speakers near the ceiling supports. The long tables were filling quickly with guests finding their assigned places. I located my seat card again and sat down calmly, smoothing the navy fabric of my dress across my lap. From there, I had a clear view of the entrance where Daniel and Ashley would soon arrive for their first toast as a married couple. The room buzzed with cheerful conversation. Some people were laughing about travel plans and hotel rooms, while others admired the centerpieces made of white roses and eucalyptus branches. After a few minutes, a man in a dark suit approached my table carrying a glass of sparkling water. I recognized him immediately. It was Charles Harrison, an old friend of Robert's and the attorney who had handled several family matters years earlier. He offered a polite nod before sitting down in the chair beside me. "Margaret," he said quietly, his voice warm but serious, "it has been a long time." I smiled and told him it was good to see him again. For a moment, we both watched the room together as guests continued taking their seats. Then he leaned slightly closer and lowered his voice so that only I could hear him. "I noticed what happened with the seating earlier," he said carefully. "I also noticed you handled it with remarkable calm." I shrugged lightly and told him that weddings can make people behave strangely. Harrison studied my expression for a moment, as if weighing something important in his mind. Then he reached into the inside pocket of his suit jacket and removed a small sealed envelope. He placed it gently on the table between us without drawing attention. "Your husband asked me to give this to you if a certain situation ever arose," he said quietly. "I believe today may qualify." I looked down at the envelope, recognizing Robert's familiar handwriting on the front. My name was written there in calm blue ink, the same careful script he used when labeling old photo albums. Around us, the room grew louder as the newly married couple entered the reception to applause and music. Everyone stood to greet them, glasses lifting into the air in celebration. I rose with the others and joined the applause, but my hand remained resting lightly on the envelope that Robert had prepared long before this wedding day ever arrived. I remained standing for the toast, my fingers resting lightly on the envelope Robert had left for me. Around the room, the applause slowly faded as Daniel and Ashley reached the center of the reception floor. Daniel raised a hand in a grateful gesture while the band shifted into a gentle melody that filled the tent with warm, celebratory sound. Guests lifted their glasses as the master of ceremonies welcomed everyone and invited us to take our seats. I sat down again and glanced at Charles Harrison beside me. He gave a small nod toward the envelope as if reminding me that it was meant to be opened when I was ready. For a moment, I simply looked at Robert's handwriting across the front. Seeing his name written so clearly after all this time created a strange feeling in my chest, something between comfort and quiet curiosity. The music softened while Daniel's best man stepped forward to begin the first speech. Laughter rippled through the room as he told stories about college days and long road trips. While everyone listened, I slid one finger carefully under the edge of the envelope and opened it. Inside was a folded letter and a smaller document printed on heavy cream-colored paper. Robert had always preferred that kind of paper for anything important. I unfolded the letter first. His handwriting was steady and familiar, each line written with the calm precision he used in everything from grocery lists to holiday cards. The letter began simply, "Margaret, if you are reading this, it means something important has happened. I hope that is not the case, but I wanted you to have clarity if it ever becomes necessary." I paused for a moment, hearing his voice in my memory as clearly as if he were sitting beside me. The speech at the front of the room continued, drawing another round of laughter from the guests, but the words around me faded into the background while I kept reading. Robert explained that during the last year of his life, he had made a few adjustments to the family trust that held most of our assets. He wrote that he trusted Daniel deeply, but understood that marriage sometimes changes the dynamics within a family. His goal had been simple. He wanted to ensure that respect remained at the center of everything. Beneath the letter was the second document, a formal page prepared by Harrison's office. I scanned the lines slowly, absorbing the meaning piece by piece. The document described a clause within the Whitmore family trust that Robert had added shortly before he passed away. The clause explained that a portion of the trust intended for Daniel would remain protected unless Margaret Whitmore was treated with dignity and inclusion within family events and decisions. If clear and documented humiliation or exclusion occurred, the trustee had the authority to redirect those funds into a charitable foundation that Robert had created many years earlier supporting local music programs in public schools. I lowered the paper slightly and looked across the reception tent. Daniel and Ashley were now standing together near the head table while guests applauded the end of another speech. Ashley laughed brightly at something one of the bridesmaids whispered to her. Daniel raised his glass again, smiling as photographers captured the moment. To anyone watching from a distance, it was the perfect wedding celebration. Beside me, Harrison spoke quietly without drawing attention. "Robert asked me to observe today," he said. He wanted to be certain that if the clause ever needed to be activated, there would be a witness. I folded the document carefully and placed it back into the envelope. My hands were steady. I felt no rush of anger or triumph, only the same calm awareness that had settled over me earlier in the garden. Across the room, the music grew louder as dinner service began and waiters carried plates toward each table. Ashley lifted her glass toward Daniel and leaned close to him, her smile wide and confident. Watching them together, I realized that the small joke with the trash can had accomplished something neither of them had expected. It had revealed a truth Robert had anticipated long before this wedding day ever arrived. I sat quietly as dinner was served, the envelope resting inside my purse like a quiet weight that only I could feel. Around me, the reception tent glowed with warm light as waiters placed plates of roasted chicken, vegetables, and fresh bread on each table. Guests spoke easily with one another, clinking glasses and complimenting the decorations. Laughter drifted across the room in gentle waves. To anyone watching, the evening looked flawless. At the head table, Daniel stood to thank everyone for coming. He spoke about love, about family, about how grateful he felt that so many people had traveled across the country to celebrate this day with him. His voice sounded sincere, and for a moment I saw the same young man who used to help his father rake leaves every fall in our backyard. I listened carefully to every word he said. When he finished, the room applauded warmly, and Ashley leaned toward him with a proud smile that seemed to glow beneath the string lights above their table. Harrison sat beside me quietly, eating only a few bites of his dinner while occasionally glancing toward the head table. After a few minutes, he spoke again in a calm voice that only I could hear. Robert believed that character reveals itself most clearly during moments of celebration, he said. People show their true priorities when they believe everyone is watching something else. I understood exactly what he meant. The wedding had created the perfect stage. Cameras, guests, decorations, speeches, everything designed to highlight joy and unity. Yet within that carefully arranged celebration, Ashley had still chosen to place a trash can beside the chair meant for her husband's mother. It had not been an accident or a careless oversight. It had been deliberate. Across the room, the band began playing a slow jazz tune while guests finished their meals. Some people stood to stretch their legs while others wandered toward the dance floor. Ashley rose from the head table and began greeting guests with confident ease, thanking them for attending and laughing brightly at their compliments. When she approached our table, her smile widened even further. "Margaret," she said cheerfully, resting a hand on the back of my chair. "I hope you found a seat that worked better for you earlier." The words were gentle, but the meaning behind them was not. A few guests nearby glanced in our direction, sensing the subtle tension that hung in the air. I looked up at her calmly. "The ceremony was beautiful," I said simply. Ashley studied my face for a moment, perhaps searching for irritation or embarrassment. When she found neither, she gave a satisfied nod and moved on to the next table. Harrison watched her walk away before turning back to me. "There is no urgency," he said quietly. "The clause does not require immediate action, but the trustee must be notified within 30 days if you believe the condition has been met." I reached into my purse and touched the envelope again, feeling the firm edge of the document inside. 30 days. That was more than enough time. Enough time for the photographs from today to circulate among family members. Enough time for guests to remember the small silver trash can beside Robert's empty chair. Enough time for Ashley's joke to become a story that people quietly repeated when discussing the wedding. I took a sip of water and looked around the room once more. Daniel was now speaking with a group of old college friends near the bar. His shoulders relaxed as he laughed at something one of them said. He had no idea what Robert had prepared years ago. No idea that a single moment of public humiliation had already placed the future of the Whitmore family trust into question. For a moment, I imagined telling him immediately, calling him over and explaining everything in front of the guests and the photographers. But that would not have been Robert's way. My husband believed that dignity was strongest when it remained calm and patient. So instead, I folded my napkin neatly beside my plate and stood as the band announced the first dance. Guests gathered around the dance floor, smiling as Daniel and Ashley stepped forward together. As the music began and they moved slowly beneath the lights, I realized something important. Ashley believed she had created a humiliating moment that would follow me for years. What she had actually done was trigger a decision that my husband had quietly prepared long before this wedding ever took place. The music for the first dance drifted softly across the reception tent as Daniel placed his hand gently at Ashley's waist, and they began moving slowly across the polished wooden floor. Guests gathered in a wide circle around them, smiling and holding their phones up to capture the moment. The string lights above cast a warm glow over everything, and for a few minutes the entire room focused only on the newly married couple. I stood quietly among the guests beside Charles Harrison, watching the scene with the same calm attention that had settled over me earlier in the garden. Ashley leaned her head lightly against Daniel's shoulder as they moved in careful steps, her expression full of satisfaction as the photographers circled around them. The crowd applauded softly when the music reached its final note, and the band immediately shifted into a livelier tune that invited everyone else to join the dance floor. People laughed and stepped forward in pairs, filling the open space with movement and cheerful conversation. Harrison turned slightly toward me and spoke in a voice low enough that it blended into the surrounding music. "You handled today with remarkable restraint," he said. Robert believed patience was the most powerful response when someone revealed their character. I nodded gently, understanding exactly what he meant. Across the room, Ashley was already greeting more guests, accepting compliments about the ceremony and the decorations. She seemed completely confident that the day had unfolded exactly the way she wanted. After a few minutes, Daniel began making his way through the crowd as well, stopping occasionally to shake hands or thank people for attending. Eventually, his path led him toward my table. When he reached me, his expression softened in the familiar way I remembered from years ago. "Mom," he said warmly, leaning down to give me a quick hug. "Thank you for coming. I know the ceremony seating was a little chaotic earlier." Ashley said there was some confusion with the chairs. His words were casual, almost distracted, as if he believed the explanation completely. I looked at him for a moment and saw how easily he accepted the version of events that required the least conflict. "The ceremony was beautiful," I told him calmly. Daniel smiled with visible relief and squeezed my shoulder before turning to greet another guest who had called his name from across the room. Harrison watched the exchange quietly before taking a slow sip of water. "Robert anticipated that Daniel might not see everything clearly right away," he said after a moment. "That is why the trust clause exists. It is meant to protect respect within the family, even when someone chooses not to notice the absence of it." I listened to the music and the laughter around us while considering his words. The evening continued exactly as a wedding reception should. Guests filled the dance floor, servers brought out slices of wedding cake, and the photographer arranged groups of relatives for pictures near the flower arch at the edge of the tent. Ashley appeared in dozens of photographs, smiling brightly beside Daniel, as if the entire day had been flawless. From time to time, our eyes met across the room. Each time she gave a small, satisfied smile, as though the earlier joke had placed me firmly in my proper place. Near the end of the evening, the band slowed the music again, and guests began collecting their coats and purses. Harrison stood beside me as I prepared to leave. "The trustee will be ready whenever you decide," he said quietly. "You do not need to rush. But once the documentation is filed, the decision will be final." I looked once more across the reception tent, where Daniel and Ashley stood thanking their guests near the exit. The night air drifted gently through the open sides of the tent, carrying the scent of roses from the garden outside. Ashley waved goodbye to a group of friends, and then turned briefly in my direction. For a moment, her eyes rested on me with the same amused confidence she had shown earlier that afternoon. I returned the look with a calm smile. In her mind, the wedding day had ended with a harmless joke that everyone would forget. In reality, it had quietly triggered the very condition my husband had prepared years ago, long before this celebration ever existed. The reception slowly came to an end as the music softened and the last groups of guests gathered near the exit of the tent. Outside, the night air had cooled, and the garden lights created small golden circles along the stone paths. I stepped outside with Charles Harrison and paused for a moment beside the rose arch where the ceremony had taken place only a few hours earlier. Most of the chairs had already been folded and stacked by the event staff, but Robert's reserved chair was still standing alone near the front row, waiting to be moved. The silver trash can was gone now, likely carried away with the rest of the cleanup. Harrison glanced toward the empty seat and then back at me. "Your husband believed moments like today reveal more than years of polite conversation," he said quietly. I nodded slowly, understanding the truth of that statement more clearly than ever. The following week, I met Harrison at his office in downtown Boston. The building overlooked the harbor, and the afternoon sunlight reflected across the water as I sat across from his desk, holding the same envelope Robert had written years earlier. Harrison reviewed the documentation carefully while explaining the next steps. The trust clause required formal acknowledgement from the trustee that a documented act of public humiliation had occurred. Fortunately, several guests had already contacted Harrison after the wedding, uncomfortable with what they had witnessed during the ceremony. One of them had even taken a photograph of the front row before the ceremony began. The image showed Robert's reserved seat beside the small silver trash can with the paper sign still taped to it. Harrison placed the photograph on the desk between us. I studied it quietly for a moment. The picture captured the exact scene I had seen that afternoon. A wedding arch of white roses, rows of decorated chairs, and a metal trash can labeled as the seat for the groom's mother. Harrison folded his hands calmly. "Once the documentation is submitted," he said, "the clause will redirect Daniel's portion of the Whitmore Family Trust to the Whitmore Arts Foundation." That was Robert's instruction. I took a slow breath and looked out the office window toward the harbor. Robert had loved music more than anything except his family. Years ago, he had helped establish that small foundation to support music programs in public schools that could not afford instruments or teachers. I imagined how many students might benefit from those funds if the clause was activated. Harrison waited patiently while I considered everything. Finally, I signed the formal notice that confirmed the condition had been met. The paperwork moved quickly after that. 30 days later, Harrison called to inform me that the trustee had finalized the transfer. The Whitmore Arts Foundation would now receive the portion of the trust that had once been intended for Daniel. A few days after that, Daniel called me. His voice sounded confused and uneasy as he explained that the bank had informed him about the change to the trust distribution. He asked if there had been some kind of mistake. I listened quietly until he finished speaking. Then I told him the truth in the calmest way I could. I explained the clause Robert had written, the documentation from the wedding, and the responsibility the trustee had to follow those instructions. There was a long silence on the phone after that. Finally, Daniel spoke again, his voice lower than before. Ashley said it was just a joke, he said. I remembered the small silver trash can beside Robert's chair, the paper sign, and the laughter drifting through the garden that afternoon. Perhaps it was, I replied gently. But your father believed respect should never be part of a joke. After we ended the call, I placed the phone down and walked to the piano that still stood in the corner of my living room. Robert had played it every evening after dinner for more than 30 years. I lifted the lid and pressed a single key, letting the sound fill the quiet house. Somewhere in a public school not far away, a young student would soon be holding a new violin or sitting in front of a piano for the very first time because of Robert's foundation. And the strange thing was that it had all begun with a trash can placed beside a wedding chair and a joke that someone believed would never matter.